Everybody to our joint side event with the Wuppertal Institute and Gold Standard. I think 2015 has been a remarkable year. I think it will go down in history as the year in which humankind has begun to embrace the global transformation towards sustainability, I think. Two milestones exemplify this moment, I think. Of course, the Paris Agreement and also the long-term new global agenda for 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. One might think that the two agreements address two separate issues, but in fact, I think that it is only one challenge. If we cannot achieve Sustainable Development Goals, we will not manage to mitigate man-made climate change effectively, but also we will not be able to attain the well below 2-degree goal if we do not simultaneously address the sustainable development issues. Carbon trading and market-based mitigation instruments can play an important role in addressing this dual challenge, but only if they serve this dual challenge. Today's side event addresses precisely this question. We have two presentations. The first presentation focuses on the environmental integrity of carbon markets under the Paris Agreement, and it will address the question, how can we make sure that international carbon trading does not undermine the mitigation ambition under the Paris Agreement, but instead helps to increase the level of ambition? And the second half of the event is dedicated to sustainable development. How can we make sure that climate mitigation projects actually are aligned with and help achieve sustainable development? But before we start, let me introduce the panel. Nico Kreibich from the Wuppertal Institute. He's a research fellow at the Wuppertal Institute. He's a political scientist working on international climate policy in general and carbon markets in particular since 2009. And he will be the presenter on the first issue, on the issue of accounting, or more generally integrity, climate integrity, environmental integrity of the Paris Agreement. Then we have Aki Kachi from Carbon Market Watch. He's international policy director at Carbon Market Watch, and before joining before joining Carbon Market Watch, sorry, he worked as a climate policy consultant for Adelphi, and amongst other things, he provided technical support also for the International Carbon Action Partnership, ICAP. He will be a discussant to the first presentation, and the second discussant will be Martin Heschen. He recently joined the EU Commission. He has been a carbon market negotiator for many, many years, 14 years, I just learned. He's a former chair of the CDM Executive Board. Before joining the Commission, he worked for the UK government, but he's Irish. And Martin will hopefully provide us with some insight on the state of the negotiations with regard to the integrity of the carbon trading under Article 6. We are now at the end of the COP, and I think he'll have to tell a lot. Then we'll switch over to the second part of the side event. Marion Verles is the CEO of the Gold Standard Foundation. Before joining Gold Standard, she led Nexus Carbon for Development, a cooperative of pro-poor low-carbon project developers. And she will hold the second presentation, in which she will provide us with the Gold Standard's answer to how projects can and should actually contribute to sustainable development. And last but not least, we have Karen Holm Olsen. She's at the Low Carbon Development Program at UNEP-DTU in Copenhagen. She has 14 years of experience working with climate and sustainable development in developing countries. She has a whole wealth of experience. She consulted, for example, the UNFCCC with regard to the Sustainable Development Tool for the CDM. She's also a team leader for development of sustainable development and transformational change guidance for NDC assessment as part of the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. And she will comment on presentation made from Marion and complement it by providing her views on market-based instruments and sustainable development under Article 6. So after the end of these sessions, we'll have hopefully some time to also discuss with you in the audience. Thank you very much. Now it's time to hand over to Nico for the first presentations.
Thank you very much, Lukas, for setting the scene. Yes, as I said, I will provide give a presentation on environmental integrity challenges and crediting approaches under Article 6. So first of all, what is Article 6? It came as a big surprise to many of us out of the Paris negotiations. It has several elements, and there are several readings to these elements too. So we'll just provide a few of them. You have Article 6.2, which could allow for bi- and multilateral crediting schemes. It could allow for linking emission trading schemes, as well as for direct party-to-party transfers. We have then Article 6.4, which establishes a new crediting mechanism, the SDM, as many people call him, the new mechanism. And we have Article 6.8, which provides a framework for non-market-based approaches. So, as you might know, there are several interpretations of these article and these elements of this article. If you want to have a look at these interpretations from parties and observing organizations, you can look at the publication from our colleague Wolfgang Obergassel. He analyzed the submissions on Article 6 to UNEP-DTU. However, we will have a look at Article 6 as a basis for crediting. So it's this interpretation of Article 6 that we will look at. And we will do this in the context of environmental integrity. So first of all, what is environmental integrity? It is, in our view, preserved if the internet transfer of mitigation outcomes from one party to the other party does not result in emissions that are higher than those emissions in a situation without such transfers. So that's just like the basic definition of that. As I said, Article 6 as a possibility to use crediting mechanism, crediting schemes. These crediting schemes, they should trigger the development or design of mitigation activities. And this is like the first stage of several stages of a crediting instrument and the transfer. So from the design, we come to the implementation of the activity. The next step would be the determination of the mitigation outcomes. Then we have the transfer of the mitigation outcomes and their use. So at each of these stages, there are several environmental integrity issues or risks associated. We have already at the design stage one crucial risk, that's non-additionality of mitigation outcomes, or non-additionality of the mitigation activity also. So this is when the crediting scheme, the overarching crediting scheme, does not trigger the design and the implementation of the mitigation activity. But there are other risks too. At the implementation stage, for instance, you have inflated baselines. This is when you will really try to go quickly through all these risks. Inflated baselines is when you overestimate those emissions that you use to compare the project emissions with. So that's the emissions in the reference scenario. You have other risks. That's flawed monitoring of activity emissions. So it should be activity emissions here, not project emissions. So this is when you do not properly monitor the project and its emissions. Another risk is if the crediting period and the project lifetime or activity period, if they are incongruous, so that the crediting period is longer than the activity period, the actual implementation. There are several risks also associated to the next step, which is the determination of the mitigation outcomes. For instance, non-permanence of these outcomes, which is when, for instance, forest, particularly relevant in the forestry context, when forests are being cut down after the end of the crediting or activity. So the emissions absorbed by this activity, they're re-emitted into the atmosphere, the gases. Yeah. You have other issues, which is another issue is carbon leakage. Is when emissions are transferred outside of the scope of the project activity or the mitigation activity in a broader sense. Then you have rebound effects, which can be indirect or direct, but they result in a global increase of emissions due to the project if they are not properly addressed. Yeah, as you see, a lot of risks already. However, in the transfer process, you have also the risk of overselling, which is when a country sells more mitigation outcomes that it actually achieved. So it sells more emission reduction than it actually reduced. And there are three other risks I will look into more detail now. It's double issuance, double claiming, and double use. These can be subsumed under the term of double counting. And we'll have a look at both elements, non-additionality and double counting in more detail. So non-additionality, I already said, is when the mitigation activity is not triggered by the crediting scheme, but it would also have been implemented in the absence of the overarching policy intervention, the crediting scheme. Yeah, what is really key here in the context of the Paris Agreement is the relationship between the activity and the NDC, the national determined contribution of the host country. So this really makes a crucial difference. If you have a crediting activity that is outside of the NDC, and which is non-additional, it will automatically lead to increase of global emissions because there is no possibility for the host country, to account for the emissions transferred. In addition, you have also the risk of perverse incentives for the country not to increase the scope of its NDC, because by increasing its scope, it would reduce possibilities for implementing mitigation activities. Another risk is, or another case is when the activity is within the scope of the NDC. So here, the non-additional activity will not necessarily lead to the undermining of environmental integrity, because that's of course only the case if you have proper accounting rules that require the country to account for these mitigation outcomes exported. So this is quite a crucial difference. However, there's also a built-in incentive to ensure the additionality of the mitigation outcome of the activity. But this is only the case if the GHG inventory has a high granularity and is accurate enough. And at the same time, if there is a high ambition of the NDC. If you have an unambitious NDC, as for instance, the experiences under joint implementation have shown, you can have non-additional projects being credited. So it really depends. Yeah, so there is really a threefold challenge, you could say, to non-additionality. One is to demonstrate the additionality at the activity level to ensure that it has been triggered by the crediting scheme. You will have to provide clarity on the relationship between the activity and the NDC. So is it within or outside the scope? Does it help to achieve the NDC? And you will have also, and that's like a dynamic challenge, you have to provide clarity on the relationship between the activity and future NDCs. So each 5 years, you would, as you have to renew your NDC, you would have provide clarity on that too. So that's quite quite some challenges here in terms of non-additionality. The other issue I wanted to talk about is double counting. And double counting, as many of you might know, occurs when a single mitigation outcome is used more than once to achieve one or more mitigation targets. So there are different forms or different situations that can lead to double counting. One is double issuance, and this is when the issuance of 2 or more mitigation units are used for, this is when one mitigation outcome results in the issuance of 2 or more mitigation units that are used for pledge attainment. So this is, of course, only relevant if you have units, if units are being issued. And the risk increases with the fragmentation of the carbon market. So if you have several standards issuing credits, can become even more complex, more difficult to detect. And what is also increasingly challenging is that if mitigation activities overlap. So this is a key risk also. And it's challenging to identify the cases when these mitigation activities overlap. Possible solutions are mitigation activity registries. So you would have to provide information on the activity, on the scope, the area, etc. And another possibility would also be to provide information on the to install a mitigation outcome registry. So you would have a registry of the units or whatever is being transferred then. And so we get this would allow you to track these transfers, and as well as a transaction log. Yeah, another problem is also leading to double counting is double claiming. And this is when 2 parties, the host country and the acquiring country, use one mitigation outcome for achieving their individual mitigation targets. So this is only relevant if the mitigation activity is within the scope of the host country's NDC, and if the GHG inventory of the host country is, again, accurate and enough and has a high resolution, so it would result in, so really the mitigation outcomes achieved would be visible in this GHG inventory. Possible solutions to this are accounting rules, robust accounting rules that require corresponding adjustments to be made for the net flow of the mitigation outcomes. However, this is also interlinked to another broader problem, that's accounting challenges more broadly. And that's also a peculiarity of the Paris Agreement with the bottom-up structure, which allows countries to define their NDCs on their own. So you have now a situation with very diverse NDCs that do not really allow to proper account for these transfers. Yeah, you see here some examples, for instance, how to account for mitigation outcomes from countries with different metrics. So you cannot really do proper accounting here. The same as if you have one country with a single-year target and another country with a multi-year target. So this will not simply not be possible. And this is not only relevant for double claiming, but also for double use. So if mitigation units are used more than once, and yeah, possible solutions are eligibility criteria. So you would restrict the access of parties to the mechanisms, or conversion of existing NDCs. So yeah, I'm coming to the end now. Some broad conclusions on this. As you have seen, there are significant risks associated to the various stages of the transfer process. And while some of these issues, they can be addressed at the technical level, there are others that are really highly political. And as for instance, non-additionality would require assessments, for instance, of the ambition of parties' NDCs, And this is, of course, highly vulnerable to political influence. And yeah, process will be highly politicized, I think. Also similar to that, the other example I gave on the diversity of NDCs and how to deal with that. If you really want to properly address the accounting challenges of associated to the diversity of NDCs, you will somehow reduce, we will have to reduce the diversity of NDCs. And this is, of course, one of the key characteristics and key features of the Paris Agreement. So yeah, this is challenging, and still a lot of work has to do has to be done on that, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nico. I would like now give the floor to Martin to fill us in a little bit on how the negotiations went with regard to the environmental integrity of market or carbon trading under Article 6, maybe.
Okay, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. There are some people in the room that also spent quite an amount of time this time around dealing with Article 6. But before saying what happened here, I perhaps want to give a bit of context to Article 6. And also, because a good friend who was a negotiator for many more years than me in the UK, called Jim Penman, he died this year, which is a very sad thing to happen. But when things got very complicated or difficult, or people were getting emotional in negotiations, as can happen from time to time, he used to say a couple of things that you needed to remember. The first thing is it's not that complicated. That's the first thing that makes you calm. The second thing is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You do what you can and don't worry about making it perfect. And then I think with a bit of a smile on his face, he'd say, it'll all be all right in the end, the very end. So that would be a kind of a stabilizing thing on all of this. The next thing, you've identified a whole range of risks, which I recognize in Article 6. But in Paris, the first risk that we had is that we might have nothing at all. And there was a large constituency that felt we wouldn't, just realistically, and a slightly smaller constituency that said that might be okay. So certainly in the EU, we worked very hard to make sure that we would have something. And my memory of Paris is of parties going around in circles a little bit about how to address all these risks and problems, and not necessarily getting anywhere. So for us, and it's something that we're quite proud of, we did a deal with Brazil over what the shape of Article 6 should be. And I think that put some momentum into the discussions when it was needed. Now, our proposal wasn't what came out in the end, but it did structure that proposal. And I think it secured a framework for some rules to address risks in using markets, which is useful in what we're talking about now. But the first risk is that we might have had a free-for-all and nothing, and no frame within which to try and address the risks. The second thing, I guess, is that we now need to implement it, and that's quite difficult. The ideals are written in, however, an imperfect form in the actual articles, but the challenge is to turn those ideals and principles into actual reality. And there's quite a diverse range of understandings of those ideals and a diverse range of understandings of how we're to implement them. But to give people an insight, if they haven't read Article 6 very carefully, and they haven't read all the submissions in Article 6 even more carefully, there are essentially three things going on in Article 6. And there's an overarching, almost a preambular language in one that references ambition and the need to address broader objectives of the Convention, including sustainable development and environmental integrity, which is right at the top, just to remind us. But the three things are, one is what happens when parties cooperate and they exchange mitigation between themselves? What's to happen there? And for us, the most important principle was, please don't double count it, because that will undermine the NDCs. That sounds simple, but in practice, it's complicated. And we have references again to environmental integrity and sustainable development there that we need to interpret and apply, and I don't think we've got very far. The second element is a mechanism. You can call it SDM, but it's the Article 6 mechanism. And it has elements that are familiar, i.e. it looks a little bit like CDM or JI in terms of the language, And it's definitely got elements that are new, which are about the new context within which this mechanism would work, namely that everybody has an NDC. And we need to struggle with that. We need to figure out how expressed ambition and incentives towards greater ambition are reflected in that mechanism. And then the third element, for those that are skeptical of market action at all, or at least want balance in respect of how we cooperate, there's something on non-market approaches, where there's a work program, not a mechanism, a work program on how we would enhance those approaches to deliver things. And it's clear we have to have balanced progress on all three, like we have to have balanced progress on everything. In the negotiations last time and this time, we have struggled, I think, to move from interpreting and having a political view or a political interpretation of our principles to move into actually identifying the sorts of rules and procedures and processes that we would need to have to deliver on them. And we're quite pushy in the sense that we would quite like to get to that stage, but have to recognize that not everybody is at the same level of understanding or the same level of readiness to move into that technical discussion. But and just to go through some of the difficult questions we would have, one is the balance between 6.8 and 6.2 and 6.4, between markets and non-markets, where we spent a lot of time talking about having balance, but maybe we don't know whether we have balance until we've done the job. The other thing is the relationship between the principle that you don't undermine the NDCs through accounting and the generation of units under 6.4. And we have not clearly established exactly what the relationship between the two things are. There are some parties that feel 6.4 is completely different and outside the scope of 6.2. There are those that feel that the two could come together. But this time around, we've been a bit more focused. We will have more submissions, and those submissions are about operationalizing elements of the three things. So if you look at our submissions at the moment, particularly our submission, we filled it with a range of questions because we felt it was useful to ask questions about how the different elements would be implemented without answering them, because people need to be on the same page in terms of what the questions are and what the operationalization is. I think in the next stage, because we've seen each other's submissions, we'll be able to get more concrete, and I'm hopeful that we will spell out the elements. And I'd like to deal with all of your risks, but I think you are way down the page, perhaps making the perfect be the enemy of the good, because we need to establish the skeleton upon which we hang all of this stuff, and we have not yet done so. And so there are important principles and important processes that we need to agree on before we can actually put safeguards on them. One of them is, when you trade, do you have to quantify your NDC? NDCs at the moment are not necessarily fully quantifiable, never mind quantified. And that's a political point. So we need to find a process whereby, because I think to trade, it assumes that one counts and therefore needs to have a number. We need to derive a number against which you account. And there are fundamental choices to be made about that number, which address questions of whether there's enough ambition in the NDCs and whether you are reporting adequately your emissions. You can choose an NDC-based mechanism for accounting, which would be analogous to Kyoto, which might contain what people call hot air, or you could choose an emissions-based approach, which doesn't generate a trajectory or a budget in the way that one might want, but at least incentivizes people to report emissions. Fundamental choice. And until that choice is made, the reporting structures, whether there are initial reports to establish the reference levels for trading, exactly what is reported, what the infrastructure for reconciling what is reported is, it's hard to speculate on it, though we have. And that's one set of issues. And throughout all of that, environmental integrity, as a principle, is there to remind you that when you make the choices, maybe you should be choosing the choice that is more environmentally integral. And for me, environmental integrity only has a meaning in terms of taking your principle and applying it to the real world. Sustainable development is slightly more complicated. We know that in doing NDCs and applying NDCs and deciding to use markets through NDCs, countries will need to consider what the balance of what they want to do is in terms of sectoral ambition, emissions profiles, and there are social and environmental considerations to what is done. That is plain. We can't be confident necessarily that all countries will do it in the same way or will do it in ways that we might be satisfied with when they choose a development path that we feel is not optimal. But in the negotiations, I think it will be very hard for us to have international oversight of sustainable development. That's the clearest thing that one hears in the negotiation, that these choices that we will make in terms of the balance of market and non-market, what sectors we use, what the social impacts of closing down coal stations are, these are things that are sovereign, and parties are happy to report on and indicate that they have considered, but not necessarily to have an imposition in respect of it. For 6.4, there's a kind of a view that we fix the CDM and insert it time. I didn't realize it took so long. As a view that it's kind of going to be CDM plus, which I think the European Union hesitate about a great deal, because I think it can't be a incremental change to what we've done before, because all parties will have NDCs, and they therefore need to think in terms of what they want to deliver for their own programs of mitigation through the mechanism. Something that doesn't really happen in the CDM, because the baseline approaches and the methodologies are universal and don't necessarily include, in fact, don't include by deliberate decision the policies that countries have adopted to undertake mitigation. And I think it will be a bit of a struggle, both technically and politically, to integrate the perspectives or integrate NDCs into the mechanism as is necessary. I'll stop there. Could go on forever.
Thank you very much. I will now hand over to Aki Kachi. Carbon Market Watch has been a voice of reason, sometimes a voice of concern in the process. Maybe keeping our time in mind, ask you to give your headline comments on the risks that Nico just laid out and Martin commented on.
So, yeah, I think these quotes that Martin has just cited are very helpful to us all. I think if we always made things so complicated or viewed them as so complicated that they were insurmountable, we would never get anywhere at all. I do have some concern that different people's tolerance of imperfection leads to outcomes that may undermine good. So the question is, in the intention of doing good, how much imperfection are we willing to let through? And what is the overall outcome in the end? I do very much like this study, and it points out many of the issues that I think that are very relevant also to the Paris Agreement, but it comes from a very Kyoto CDM understanding of the world, maybe Kyoto CDM and JI. And I think that there I'm also very much in accord with Martin. We're very far away from that step. The definition of environmental integrity that we had up on the screen is also something that parties are not in complete agreement about, and that we see I likely in the summary by Wolfgang, which I haven't had an opportunity to read yet, but having read many of the submissions, there are large disagreements about what environmental integrity means, how to operationalize ambition, and the ever ongoing debate about what and how to measure sustainable development, which we'll hear about more in a moment. I think I would have liked to, I mean, there's a lot of issues about governance that you touch on, and the problems of accounting among the diversity of NDCs. And you suggest some problems, or some solutions rather. My concern is that there's no, I would have liked to hear a little bit more about the political feasibility of these solutions. And what does that feasibility mean for the future of the mechanism or these mechanisms? And I wasn't completely sure if this sort of investigation of what environmental integrity could mean. You highlighted 6.4 and one interpretation of 6.2, but I wasn't completely sure how you see the governance between those. Are they going to be interpreted in the same way? Are you going to have very similar governance structures? similar definitions, etc., etc. And I mean, having mentioned from those issues, I didn't see that much. I mean, there was some mention of rebound effects and things. I think there's some issues of environmental integrity that are very hard to address, even with sort of broader technical measures. I think there's an inherent potential source of perverse incentives with all of these. And what does it mean for the future of stock takes and increased ambition of NDCs when you're crediting from outside of NDC, or what does it mean for the future ambition of NDCs when you're crediting from within your NDC? So I see that as an ambition question and an environmental and integrity question that I think would merit further exploration.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we're running a little bit behind schedule, but I think we will have some time left for also taking questions from the floor. But now it's time to start the second half of our presentations, and I would like to hand over to Marion and the question of sustainable development under Article 6 in the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's the last day of a very long 2 weeks. So thank you for joining us this morning. We heard the complexity that is associated with the issue of environmental integrity. I will focus on the other side of the coin, if you want, and share with you our thinking at Gold Standard about how one could approach the question of sustainable development. So, as a big picture starting point, I think, as we heard at the beginning of the session, 2015 was a very important year at Gold Standard. Our vision is climate security and sustainable development for all. We believe that sustainable development can be a very powerful lever for more ambitious climate action, but we also realize and acknowledge the fact that climate security is a prerequisite for sustainable development. So with 2015 behind us, I think everyone is acknowledging the importance of linking the two. The question is how one can do it in practice. We believe that from a sustainable development perspective, it's important to demystify the issue. Looking at the last 10 years of experience with the carbon markets, there's a reason why sustainable development wasn't fully integrated into existing market mechanisms. And we believe that there's 4 important myths that we need to fight every day and challenge every day if we are to do better post-2020 than we have up until now. And we have published a detailed paper on those 4 myths and our recommendations going forward. But I'll be going quickly over them now, and I encourage you to look at the full paper online. I think that the first myth is that sustainable development is a broad concept without a clear definition. Obviously, with the Sustainable Development Goals, we have a very strong counter-argument, but some still argue that the 17 SDGs, the 169 targets, and the 300 plus indicators are too many and are broadening the concept to a point where it loses any real definition. At Gold Standard, we believe that the SDGs provide a much stronger basis than their predecessors, the MDGs, and we can't oversimplify sustainable development. What we need to focus our efforts on is how can we actually manage that level of complexity. But simplifying the topic is not going to help achieve those ambitious objectives. The second myth, and that's one that's very relevant in the context of the negotiations within the UNEP-DTU family, if you want, is that talking about sustainable development in the context of the negotiations may lead to interference with national prerogatives. We have heard from a number of parties strong fear that by putting up a definition of sustainable development, we would interfere with their own national prerogatives. And I think here it's important to clarify that it's not because we have a common language that we're telling people what to say. So we're all using English as a common language, but it's not because we're all using the same language that anyone is forcing you to say something you don't want to be saying. So it's a bit the same with the Sustainable Development Goals. We now have a common language to talk about sustainable development. We have common ways of framing the issues and the objectives, but it doesn't mean that we are imposing national targets and national objectives. Those national 2030 agendas will be set by national governments. The national priorities will be set and defined by the national governments, but they have the possibility now to do so using a common framework that everyone understands. So it's very important to realize that there's no contradiction between a global framework or a global language and nationally set development priorities. On that topic, I think it's also good to remind ourselves that the parties to the Paris Agreement are the same parties who endorsed, adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are the same countries that embraced those two international agendas, yet the negotiators, so the people at the table, are different. And we really need to start creating bridges between the negotiators within the UNEP-DTU context and those who have led the adoption by their countries of the 17 SDGs. A third myth is that sustainable development provisions are incompatible with market mechanism. And I was talking to my predecessor, Michael Schlup, who was the first CEO of the Gold Standard, and I was telling him, so what is the best argument you can make against that myth? And he told me, Marion, the best argument is to say that when Gold Standard was started about 10 plus years ago, we were told, and I'm quoting what he was told, that Gold Standard was a side joke, that sustainable development had nothing to do with carbon market and with market mechanisms. Yet 10 plus years later, we realized that actually sustainable development has everything to do with market mechanisms, because in order for parties and people to trust those mechanisms, it's critical to demonstrate that sustainable development considerations are intrinsically incorporated into the criteria. It's actually the lack of sustainable development safeguards that created mistrust in those markets. These are the human rights violation issues associated with some CDM project that created the distrust in the markets that we're still fighting now. So the lack of sustainable development consideration is actually undermining the public support and the broad stakeholder support we need for those markets to grow and strive. And the other point which I would like to make here is to realize that beyond carbon markets, looking at other type of markets, commodities market, we see a global trend towards decommoditization. Everyone buying sugar or coffee or milk is going to look for a label. We want fair trade, we want organic, we want many different quality labels that will tell us that what we're buying is actually of high quality. And it's the same with carbon markets. We want to know the quality of the product we're buying. And so that trend towards decommoditization is also impacting the carbon markets. The fourth myth is really that, and it sort of echoes the first one, is that sustainable development is too complex. It cannot be measured, so let's just leave it out. And let's not slow down the negotiations by trying to do too much. Well, we have demonstrated over the last 10 plus years that it can actually be done, and there are simple solutions that can help mitigate a large part of the risk associated with sustainable development. So going beyond those challenges and those myths, what are sort of concrete solutions that we're putting on the table? Keeping in mind that perfection is the enemy of the good, we focused here on 2 solutions that are not exhaustive or comprehensive, but which we believe are a good starting point for a discussion. The first one is really focusing on eligibility criteria. So can we make sure that projects that will be accepted by future market mechanisms are inclusive, take into account national development priorities, and are intrinsically contributing to the national 2030 agenda? Can we make that simple, easy to understand eligibility criteria for any project that will be accepted into a accrediting mechanism? Once we've done that, then a second step is to create and make available to project implementers on the ground simple, easy to use tools that link back to globally accepted approaches to assess the actual contributions that a project is having towards sustainable development as defined by the host country. Can we make it possible for a climate action to also state unquestionable how it also contributes to health, gender empowerment, biodiversity? If we were to make those tools available, then we will make it easier for those who are funding those projects, for those who are buying those units or credits or ITMOs, whatever they're called. We would make it easier for them to choose projects that are delivering the impacts they want beyond climate. So 2 very simple solutions that can take us a long way into recognizing and integrating sustainable development and using it as a tremendous lever for more ambitious climate action. So at Gold Standard, we are launching Gold Standard for the Global Goals, which is really an evolution of our standard to serve sustainable development across the 17 SDGs. We have always and will continue to stand for the best that can be done in climate and development. And in order to fulfill that ambition, we are upgrading our tools and standards. Environmental integrity as well as stakeholder consultations and tools and methodologies to quantify the sustainable development contributions can help increase the volume of investments that actually go to those climate activities. I think what's important to bear in mind is that obviously when we open the sustainable development topic, we are adding up a lot of complexity to what is already a complex topic. It's important to realize that I think that the carbon market family and market mechanism family has overlooked the potential of IT solutions to drastically simplify project development time and cost. And we believe that in the next generation of market mechanisms, we need to make sure that IT solutions are core, are central to all the tools that are being developed, so that project developers, host countries on the ground, but also auditors, funders, buyers have access to user-friendly systems and interfaces to actually play their role in those markets. So again, not simplifying complexity, but providing the tools and the solutions to be able to manage it properly. And I'll finish with that. I think for us, what's critical is to recognize that there is a virtuous circle. If we can actually demonstrate that climate actions are not only serving a better climate, but that they're also having tangible, quantifiable, third-party verified contributions towards national sustainable development priorities. If we can do that, then those who are managing those actions or investing in those actions will be able to report on all those amazing impacts that they have contributed to. They will be able to gain recognition for those investments. And with recognition will come stakeholder support. And with stakeholder support will come greater ambition. And if we are to meet the challenge of a 1.5-degree world where the 2030 agenda for sustainable development is achieved, we really need to raise the level of ambition. And we can't do that without recognizing the sustainable development contributions of climate actions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marion, for this insightful presentation. I would like now to invite Karen to comment on that and fill us in with your perspective also on the balance of sustainable development and mitigation in all this.
It's open. My name is Karen, and I am from the UNEP-DTU partnership, which is based at the Technical University of Denmark, which means I have a research background. I have worked on sustainability assessment from a social science perspective and coming very much from the CDM. So with that experience of more than 10 years looking at how did the CDM contribute to sustainable development, or rather, how did it not, and what can science say about it? Science is actually very inconclusive, because the assessment of whether or not CDM contributed to sustainable development depends on the methods of assessment. Some that take a more top-down perspective, aggregate perspective, think it did contribute. Others that take a more community perspective, the bottom-up perspective, think it did not. It's also a matter of whether you focus on the benefits, the positive impacts, or the negative impacts. So if you look at something like the policy dialogue that looked at the CDM experience, because it was an aim to contribute to sustainable development, they were inconclusive. It's just opinions diverge on this topic a lot. So I can confirm what Marion has said, that there are so many myths out there on the topic of sustainable development. And it's really a paradox that everybody agrees in rhetoric, we must have sustainable development. I sit with me, in front of me, I have the Marrakesh Action Proclamation for our climate and sustainable development. It's prominent. And it's much more prominent in the Paris Agreement than it ever was in the Kyoto Protocol. In spite of that, when we get to the operational level, it's challenging, I think, as Martin said. And it's full of politics. So really, it's very exciting, I think, to see the gold standard coming out with a version 3 for the global goals. I think they're doing pioneering work. So some reactions on my experience coming from CDM, and moving now towards what's in the Paris Agreement on Article 6. My reading of Article 6, the language in there is that it's much more prominent than it was in the Kyoto Protocol. It's mentioned many more times in the Paris Agreement than it was in Kyoto Protocol. It's the objective of all the cooperative mechanisms in Article 6. And even if you read the language, it's exactly the same as it was in the CDM article, Kyoto Protocol Article 12, but the framing is different. And the impact of the framing being different is that even though it says that the benefits of mitigation actions must be real, long-term, and what's the third one? Measurable. Yes, it's the exact same language. That language applies not only to the GHG emission reductions, but it applies to the mechanism as a whole in the Paris Agreement. And the mechanism as a whole has the dual objective. So that means that the benefits are not only greenhouse gas emission reductions, it's also sustainable development outcomes that must be real, measurable, and long-term. So what does that mean? That means that, as we hear from Marion, it was always a national prerogative to decide this at the national level. But now my reading is there's also a new political mandate to look at this at the international level. So who will develop the rules, modalities, procedures for sustainable development impact assessment? That is now I think, postponed. We will have another 2 years. The Paris Agreement was ratified so quick. So we need to postpone the rules, modalities, and procedures. We will not have them now in Marrakesh. It will take another 2 years to develop that. But there is a mandate to do that at the international level. We didn't have that in CDM. In fact, there was only very late coming out the CDM Sustainable Development Tool, developed in 2012, available online in 2014. And as Marion is saying, it's not a definition of sustainable development, but it's a framework, it's a common language, so that there's enough flexibility and room for countries to set their own priorities for development being sustainable. So that's the politics, the framing, which is different in the Paris Agreement than it was in the Kyoto Protocol. Technically, we are working on these issues, not so much in context of CDM anymore, but we are, however, trying to learn from that experience, and in context of the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, the transparency framework. Lukas mentioned the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, which is something UNEP-DTU is working on, and many other institutions, a Verified Carbon Standard, World Resources Institute, and many other implementing partners, and a lot of experts. And we are developing methodologies, not only for GHG emission reduction accounting, also for sustainable development impact assessment, and for something new called transformational change, which perhaps speaks a little bit about the challenge of environmental integrity and non-additionality. Is additionality the right concept to incentivize enhanced ambition now that we are moving from projects to policies? Maybe not. There's so many perverse incentives around baselines and additionality that maybe it's not the right concept to incentivize enhanced ambition. Maybe transformational change is a better concept, something that the climate finance institutions are certainly applying when they're screening proposals. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Karen. Before I want to open the floor to you to give room for your questions, I want to highlight that the background papers behind the presentations from Marion and Nico are available. If you use these token things, you can, outside this door on my left, there is a counterpart of these things where you can download it. And I've also flyers for our side with these. So if you go out, find them in the back, and you can take the insights behind the presentations, take them with you. I would now like to give the floor to you, and I see the first hands raised. So I'll take 3 questions. Axel Michalova first, maybe.
Yes, Axel Michalova from University of Zurich in Perspectives. My question would be to Martin and Karen. With regards to additionality assessment for upscaling of mechanisms, for example, crediting for introduction of policy instruments. I understand, Karen, that you say, well, additionality is an old concept, get away with it and replace it by transformational change. I would have some doubts, because eventually transformational change is also about underlying additionality issues. For example, is a policy additional? So it's, in my view, a bit of a wording issue, but the underlying concept that we need to deviate from business as usual and make a change is the same. So I really would like to get your views on how, in the context of going beyond projects, we can check whether we are not just doing business as usual.
Then there was this blue jacket behind Mr. Michalova.
Hello, my name is Connor Fox. I work with Testing Innovation. We do carbon financed cook stoves in Africa. And we've almost predominantly worked with the gold standard and have generated finance and be able to leverage a lot more finance to reach almost 300,000 households in Malawi and Rwanda. It's over 1.5 million people with access to cleaner cooking. But recently we see CDM credits generating more revenue per household. So my question is, have we seen the heyday of the voluntary carbon market? That's one question. And the other question would be is, as cookstove developers, it would be very difficult for us to quantify all the impacts, especially health impacts, because it's very complicated. Would it be possible to have a positive list of technologies and practices where specialists can try and come up with conservative calculations for impacts, and project developers can just choose from the positive list of practices and technologies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then there was one question in the back. If you could also say your name. And
yes, my name is Nico from the French delegation. Thank you very much for the presentations. One question to the panel in general, maybe a little bit more to Marion and to Martin. I mean, you both spoke about sustainable development in different way. Martin saying that international oversight may be difficult on sustainable development, while Marion spoke about eligibility criteria and going basically in this direction, and that is actually possible. I just wanted to have some, from both of you, a reality check in regards of the text of the Article 6, and especially in regards of the word guidance. And what's your feeling in regards to this? Can a guidance be some kind of middle approach in regards to sustainable development, and how you see it? Thank you.
yeah, thanks for these very interesting questions. There was a question on transformational change, additionality. How can we make sure we go beyond business as usual? Who would want to answer that question? Maybe Karen or Michael, Martin, sorry.
Yeah, so I don't think business as usual is a concept anymore. Like this is one of the consequences of there being NDCs, in the sense that the context within which the mechanism has to operate is that countries have nationally determined commitments to do emission reductions. Well, but in the crediting point of view, they do refer to business as usual in their NDCs. This is true. But there are reductions on business as usual. There's no plan to have business as usual emissions. And so in that sense, one has to ask what the relevance of business as usual is to crediting. Because if one credits against business as usual, you're not crediting against an NDC. So it's an interesting question. The concept of additionality is very firmly in the text, but I think we need to look at exactly how it's applied. And it's been raised in the negotiations that it needs to be, in the view of some, additional to the level of ambition implied by the NDC. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because countries will need to, and I don't think that the penny has dropped, countries will need to decide when they are deciding to allow things to be sold abroad, how much they want to keep and how much they want to sell. And that could apply in a policy context, but the starting point has to be that policies are adopted to deliver NDCs, and insofar as anything within the scope of that policy is credited and sold abroad, it's not delivering the NDC domestically, and we need to work through that. So I think additionality, while it's there, has a fundamentally changed principle.
Karen, do you want to add something?
Yes, I think that even though it's not something that I've thought through entirely, we still need to understand all the types of NDCs and what does that mean for environmental integrity. I think that trying to treat something inherently politically as something you can solve technically with some kind of definition of additionality, I'm not sure I believe in that. I think I do not. I think that we need some other concept, perhaps transformational change, to incentivize the ambition that we want for the global goals.
Then there was the question on both the heyday of the voluntary carbon market and difficulties in assessing health benefits of cookstove projects. I think, Marion, you're in a position to answer this question.
Sure. So the question on heyday of carbon market, you refer to CDM bringing more value now to some projects. I don't think that this is because there's been a good deal, a good CDM deal once, that it means that the voluntary carbon markets are over. So, however, having said that, I think the markets generally, compliance and voluntary, are going through a difficult time, because beyond the issues we all know about that relate to oversupply and lack of demand, we're now getting very close to that 2020 time frame. And what we see at Gold Standard is a significant drop in new projects registration because of the lack of incentive or the lack of uncertainty on what is going to happen post-2020. And that is, for me, a key area of concern, because if we can't give the private sector an idea of what is going to happen post-2020, we may end up losing on the opportunity to invest now for emission reductions now. And I think that would be a problem, because we all know how important the reductions we can achieve now are for the climate. So the question is, how can we create that post-2020 certainty that will incentivize private sector investments and have that as soon as possible, ideally. And that's relevant for both the compliance and the voluntary market, I would say. On the quantification of impacts, I think it's important to keep in mind that not every methodology will be relevant and appropriate for every type of project. There are some methodologies like the health one that are very heavy, very costly, but which will give health funders the certainty that a cook stove intervention has contributed to improving human life in a way that's as rigorous as required by the health community. So there's nothing we can do here to reduce that level of rigor, because it's the level of rigor that's required by health funders to unlock funding for those interventions. However, what we are working on is the development of simple, easy to use, what we call internally SDG tools, that will give you an idea for a given climate intervention and a robust high-level assessment of what are the key SDGs to which you contribute. So there will be lower cost, lower time-intensive tools that will help paint the real picture of the benefits that an intervention is having. So we are working on that. I think that the last question on the SD and Article 6, and I'd be interested to know what Martin thinks about that. I think it's, I mean, there will be really two ways of looking at it, whether you're looking at 6.2 or 6.4. I think what's important in our approach at Gold Standard is really to produce tools and solutions that can hopefully inspire negotiators. So if we can demonstrate that those tools, eligibility criteria, safeguarding assessments, holistic contributions to SD are actually readily available, then we hope that we can inspire future market mechanisms to reuse them.
Aki, you want to?
Just a brief comment on the difference or the issues of deviation from business as usual and additionality versus a transformational change. I think that it's clear that in this world, with the challenge that we face, that a deviation from business as usual is not sufficient. And I think that one good example of that is supercritical coal. I mean, it's a question whether it's additional in the first place, but even if it were additional and it does reduce emissions, to what extent does it actually get us to where we need to be in the long term, and to what extent does it actually promote a paradigm shift and transformational change in how we operate the global energy system, and how does it get us further? And I think it doesn't get us further, and I think maybe it's too early to completely say that additionality is not relevant anymore, or that business as usual is something that's a little bit different when everyone has NDCs. But I think when we are providing incentives through markets to change behaviors, investment patterns, et cetera, they all need to be compatible with a long-term goal and how we get there. And we need to think that a little deviation from business usual is not enough, and we need to be thinking about more fundamental ways about how to promote transformational change. And just very briefly, I don't look at the voluntary markets in that detail. And I think that that relates a lot to the fractionalization of markets that the Wuppertal Institute colleagues mentioned earlier. But I do think that as much as there are governance issues and problems that are that emerge with that kind of fractionalization, that I am happy to see that different approaches and the flexibility that the voluntary market does afford to thinking can drive positive thinking and change and innovation in markets as well.
Okay, then there was this question in the back of the room on, I would interpret it as how compulsory or how binding is guidance, and in what direction do we interpret it? Martin, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's promote from what I remember, at least in one of the paragraphs. I just know from our discussions in the room, there's an invitation to be inspired. And I think one can be inspired, but as to whether one can act on it is another thing. I think market participants who want to have high quality projects in a particular context should be inspired and apply the best tools that are available to promote and ensure sustainable development. I just don't think it's politically feasible that sustainable development criteria will be eligibility criteria for the mechanism still S62, simply because parties are, from what I hear, very much attached to making their own application. And there may be a national level application of these tools, but I just don't think that the UN or bodies mandated by the UN will be enabled to qualify and disqualify activities or systems on the basis of whether they meet these criteria. It's just something that I don't think countries will agree.
Mm-hmm. Maybe, Karen, when you were giving your reading on Article 6 and the sustainable development in it, I saw Martin's face reacting. I wasn't sure whether you really think that there's a convergence of views, that your view is actually a widely shared view, and to what extent do you think that maybe there is still room to get together, and where the front lines are? Is it between developed and developing countries that some think of the new mechanism, for example, more of a mitigation mechanism than a sustainable development mechanism, or is it the other way around?
I didn't see Martin's face when I spoke, sorry. I know that from many years of working on this topic that sustainable development assessment is very controversial, is in spite of the rhetoric that everybody agrees to have it, in spite that it's in the declaration, Marrakesh Action Proclamation for our climate and sustainable development. When it comes to operationalization, I know the issues of sovereignty very well. However, regarding whether countries are prepared for guidance at international level, I think they are. I think some countries are. And in context of the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, where we are developing methodologies for accounting for impacts, tracking progress of NDCs, we are in context of this actually quite big initiative on Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, developing guidelines, we call it good practice, on sustainable development assessment, which is going to be very flexible. It is, as Marion says, it's. I think we need to demystify it. I think we need to explain what that guidance can and does, so that people don't get. So that the sovereignty concerns of countries are respected. And I think one interesting outcome of evaluating the sustainable development tool for CDM was that I think it was 94% of the DNAs, the national authorities, that liked the CDM Sustainable Development Tool because they felt that it respected their sovereignty. So I think it is a myth that it's so difficult and impossible to have international level guidance on sustainable development. I think it is possible, and we're doing it.
Martin, brief comment before we
Yeah,
take the next
I
one.
just think you need to be very, very clear about what is what you say when you say that, because I heard eligibility, right? And I think that is the political problem. It's undoubtedly true that countries are happy to and willing to engage in guidance on the assessment of sustainable development. But that is a very different thing from saying that these criteria are eligibility criteria at the international level. And that's the sovereignty point. That's so parties may apply them and parties may report on them and parties may in their implementation be very satisfied with their application of them, but the fear in the negotiation room is that there's an attempt to make projects uneligible unless they apply criteria, and those criteria are interpreted by an executive board or something else.
Nico, do you want to fill in?
One comment also on the assessment, whether it will be feasible to have like international SDG criteria being used for SD impact. I think, well, the Sustainable Development Tool, it's good to hear that many DNAs like the tool and applied it. However, it's not mandatory or was not mandatory and does not cover negative impacts. And so, of course, I think it's easier for a country just to highlight positive, or for a project to highlight positive impacts. Well, not, I think the critical ones are the negative. And this is, I think, a key in this regard. So hopefully still, of course, I also hope that there will be a possibility to come to a common ground on using SDGs as like a menu, maybe, that could be to choose from. Yeah.
So very briefly, in 2 words, qualifying what I was saying about eligibility criteria, it's important to clarify that this doesn't need to be done or decided at the international level through a CDM executive board-like process. It could also be a national level assessment. But the point was really to say that the question we're being asked is, how do you integrate sustainable development considerations into market mechanisms? So one way to integrate them is to look at making sure they are part of the eligibility criteria. And that assessment can happen at many different levels and through different shapes and forms. And obviously the national authorities have a critical role to play here.
So we have some, well, not quite 10 minutes left, but if there are any further questions from the floor, is there any? Every question answered, I guess. I don't know if anyone from the panel who has something on his heart, her heart.
Yeah. I mean, I hesitate to say this, but and it's not to take away from the guidance on assessment of sustainability, but we'll go back to the context within which we're operating. And one of the main objectives that is under negotiation at the moment is to make sure that when markets are used, they deliver on emission reductions, and they don't make things worse. And on top of that, that they don't undermine further ambition. And both of those things are in themselves a contribution to sustainable development, as reminded me by many of my development colleagues, that if one reduces the costs of doing what we have to do to reach 2 degrees, that means there's more resources to concentrate on other goals. So just to put that in that broader context, that markets, while unpopular with some, or somehow there are risks of promoting impacts that are negative or not accentuating the positive, in concept, it should contribute to sustainable development by delivering on emission reductions, delivering on increased ambition, and freeing up or at least avoiding the incredible cost that climate change will cause to us if we don't do it earlier. So I just make that plea as well.
There's another question on the floor. Great.
Thank you. Hear me?
Yeah,
Kate Hancock from the Australian delegation. My question is to Nico on the environmental integrity issue, so skipping back from sustainable development.
can you speak up a bit?
Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. Shall I repeat my question? So it relates to environmental integrity, and you said something like the way to address the risks that you listed was to reduce the diversity of NDCs. And my observation is that I can't see how you can do that in a politically acceptable way. And my question is, so does that mean that we just have to live with those risks, or are you going to think about what else we can do that's actually a practical solution for us?
Well, yeah, basically, you're partly right. The diversity of NDCs makes it extremely challenging in terms of properly account for the transfers. So you would not necessarily reduce all the diversity of all NDCs, but you could, or you would have to put some eligibility criteria, again, sorry, to countries if they want to participate in some of these activities, because otherwise you simply would not be able to, properly account. I think it could be very useful to look at concrete submissions that have been submitted, concrete NDCs that have been submitted. Look how they are framed, which type of NDCs they are, and what type of transfers would be possible with these real NDCs within these indices and with other countries. So there you could get a more complete picture of what the real challenges are and possible solutions also that are not reducing the diversity, because I think it's really a crucial element of the Paris Agreement to have such diverse NDCs, and imposing very strict characteristics would, I don't know if would kill the momentum, but could be another risk in terms of the political process. So, yeah.
There's another question here in the.
Yes, Maria Lee from WOCAN, Women Organizing for Change in Agriculture and Natural Resource Management. Thank you for this panel. I'm not technical and expert on the carbon markets, but I thought it was very interesting, and I really want to thank Marion to be pushing also these social benefits beyond the environments, and we will be working together on that, I think. My question is regarding the private sector in this whole discussion, and the fact that we've been hearing as well that private investors and corporations now are not only interested in their carbon offsets, but also interested in adding some social co-benefits to that. So how do you see this kind of intention maybe driving or influencing this whole agenda? Thank you.
Someone of the panelists who volunteers to answer that question? Marion, maybe?
Yes, I think that unfortunately it's not going to have a lot of influence on what's happening within the negotiations. However, I think it's really encouraging to see the private sector more and more taking leadership positions and demonstrating that sustainable development assessments are also a lever for more ambitious climate action. And that is something that we hear more and more from corporates willing to engage with the voluntary and compliance carbon markets, that if you can actually give them the tools to paint a real picture of the contributions that their investments are having, contributions across climate change, but also across sustainable development. If we can make those tools available to them, we know that we will contribute to raising their level of ambition. So whilst it may not have and probably won't have any impact on the what's actually being decided, it's still, from a climate perspective, I think it's really important.
So if there are no any further questions on the floor, I would be very happy to thank all the panelists for this very interesting discussions. I think it was really played out quite well. My personal gemstone in taking away is really the question that I realized that actually the Paris Agreement is a call to shift what's business as usual. And I think that's something we need to think about more. Maybe transformational change is one way of thinking about it. Additionality or change of the concept of additionality is another way of thinking about it. But that's my personal takeaway. Thank you very much, I think, for this very insightful presentations and the brilliant discussions we had. Thank you.
My problem is to do it's fun. It's fun. Ja, gut gelaufen. Danke. Du auch.
There's not a lot of to watch.
Well. I understand that. I was on the board my problem is the shoes have a perfect